My dad's a billionaire. He's gonna make you pay.
Imagine you're 9 years old, 30,000 feet in the air, and the only thing standing between your father and a medical emergency is your cell phone and the 3 numbers every child is taught to memorize. Now imagine that the reason you're making that call isn't because of turbulence or engine failure, but because another human being decided your father didn't deserve help. This is the story of how little Zara Mitchell became the youngest person to ever file a federal discrimination complaint against a major airline, and how one phone call exposed a truth that millions of people face every single day but rarely talk about. But before we get to that moment when Zara's fingers trembled over those 3 numbers, before we understand why a flight attendant would stand between a disabled man and his medication, we need to go back 48 hours, to a penthouse apartment in Chicago where a little girl was learning that sometimes being brave means doing what terrifies you most. Zara Mitchell woke up every morning at 6:15, not because she had to, but because her father needed her to. In the soft gray light of early morning, while most 9-year-olds were still dreaming about recess and cartoons, Zara was in her father's bathroom, counting pills into a weekly organizer with the precision of a pharmacist. Blue pill for blood pressure. White capsule for nerve pain. Small yellow tablet for muscle spasms. Large white pill for inflammation. She knew them all by heart, knew which ones he took with breakfast and which ones had to wait until after lunch, knew which ones made him sleepy and which ones he absolutely couldn't skip. Her bedroom told the story of a child caught between 2 worlds. Glow-in-the-dark stars covered her ceiling in the exact pattern of the Orion constellation. Robotics trophies lined one shelf, first place at the district competition, second place at regionals. On her nightstand sat a worn stuffed elephant named Professor Trunks, its gray fur faded from years of being held tight during the scary moments. And on her desk, next to her homework, sat a laminated card her father had made for her, listing every medication, every dosage, every emergency contact number. Most kids her age had cheat sheets for multiplication tables. Zara had a cheat sheet for keeping her father alive. She hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, Zara Mitchell had been a normal 7-year-old who believed that parents were invincible and that the worst thing that could happen was forgetting your lunch money. Then her mother got sick. Stage 4 breast cancer, the doctors said, though Zara didn't understand what stages meant back then. She understood it now. Stage 4 meant watching your mother get smaller and quieter until one day she wasn't there anymore. Stage 4 meant your father crying in the shower where he thought you couldn't hear him. Stage 4 meant becoming the woman of the house before you even finished elementary school. After her mother died, something shifted in Zara. While other kids were trading Pokemon cards at recess, she was researching how to help people with spinal cord injuries. While her classmates were watching cartoons after school, she was practicing how to check if someone was having a medical emergency. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called her father in for a conference 3 months ago, concerned that Zara was growing up too fast and taking on too much responsibility. Her father had tried to shield her more after that, had hired their housekeeper Nina to help with his care during the day. But Zara still woke up at 6:15. She still counted the pills. Because if she didn't, who would? The only person who really understood was Sophie Chin, her best friend since kindergarten. Sophie's older brother had died in a car accident when they were both 6, so she knew what it felt like when the world stopped making sense. They never talked about it directly, but there was an understanding between them, a shared language of loss that made words unnecessary. While other kids complained about their parents being embarrassing or strict, Zara and Sophie held on a little tighter, grateful for what they still had. That Tuesday morning in October, Zara finished organizing the pills and padded down the hallway to her father's home office. The door was cracked open and she could hear his voice, strong and commanding, the voice that ran boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals. Through the gap, she could see him in his wheelchair, facing 3 computer monitors, his dark suit jacket perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with precision. To anyone on those video screens, David Mitchell looked like exactly what he was. A man in complete control. What they couldn't see was the way his left hand trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. They couldn't see the beads of sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature. They couldn't see the way he shifted his weight every few minutes, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. Zara saw all of it. David Mitchell's story was the kind that magazines loved to write about, the kind that motivators used in their speeches, the kind that made people believe in the American dream. Raised in the south side of Chicago by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, he'd been the first person in his family to go to college. Full ride to Northwestern on a football scholarship. Pre-med major with a minor in business. Everyone said he was going places, that he'd be the first black quarterback to win a Heisman, that the NFL was already watching him. He believed it too. Then came November 14th, his junior year. The game against Michigan State. Third quarter they were down by 4 and David dropped back for a pass. He never saw the linebacker coming from his blind side. The hit was legal, the kind of tackle that happens 100 times every Saturday. But this time the angle was wrong. This time, David's body twisted in a way that spines aren't meant to twist. This time when he went down he didn't get back up. T6 complete spinal cord injury, the doctors told him. Paralyzed from the chest down. At 20 years old, David Mitchell went from running 40 yards in 4.4 seconds to measuring his world in wheelchair-accessible inches. The NFL scouts stopped calling. His girlfriend stopped visiting. His teammates sent cards that got less frequent as the months went on. Everyone had dreams for David Mitchell. Nobody's dreams included a wheelchair. But here's what nobody expected. David Mitchell wasn't done dreaming. Couldn't play football? Fine, he'd learn to play a different game. From his hospital bed he taught himself coding. From his rehabilitation center he started taking online business courses. By the time he graduated, 2 years late and with a completely different major, he'd already built the prototype for what would become Mitchell Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that helped companies protect their data infrastructure. He pitched investors from his wheelchair, refused to let anyone feel sorry for him, and closed his first major contract 6 months after graduation. That was 15 years ago. Now, Mitchell Tech Solutions employed over 2,000 people across 6 countries and was valued at $3.2 billion. David Mitchell had been featured in Forbes, invited to speak at TED, and asked to consult for the Department of Defense. He'd proven every single person wrong who'd written him off when he couldn't walk anymore. But success doesn't mean the struggle ends. David still woke up every morning with nerve pain that felt like electrical fires running through his body. He still took 17 pills a day just to function. He still had to plan every single aspect of his life around accessibility, around whether buildings had ramps, whether bathrooms had grab bars, whether people would see him as competent or make assumptions based on his wheelchair. And lately the pain had been getting worse. His doctor, Patricia Okonkwo, had been blunt during his appointment the week before. Sitting across from him in her office, she'd pulled up his latest scans and said the words he'd been dreading. David, your body is breaking down. The chronic pain, the muscle spasms, the tremors, they're all getting worse because you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to slow down. But David couldn't slow down. Not now. He had a meeting in San Francisco that could change everything, a potential merger with a West Coast tech giant that would take Mitchell Tech Solutions from billion-dollar company to industry titan. More importantly, he had something to prove. Not to investors or competitors, but to his daughter. He needed Zara to see that disabilities didn't define limitations, that you could build an extraordinary life regardless of what your body could or couldn't do. If he started slowing down now, started letting his condition dictate his choices, what message would that send to her? So when Dr. Okonkwo had suggested postponing his travel, he'd smiled and said he'd be fine. She'd looked at him with the expression of someone who'd heard that line too many times before. David, I'm serious. Your stress levels are through the roof, your blood pressure is elevated, and you're showing signs of autonomic dysreflexia. If you have an episode while traveling, especially on a plane, it could be life-threatening. I'll have my medication with me, he'd assured her. Medication only works if you can access it when you need it, she'd countered. What if there are delays? What if something goes wrong? Then I'll handle it, he'd said. I always do. Now, sitting in his home office, finishing up a video call with his executive team, David wondered if maybe Dr. Okonkwo had been right. His left hand was trembling more than usual, and there was a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. But the meeting was in 3 days. The investors were flying in from Tokyo specifically to see him. He couldn't back out now. His assistant, Marcus Webb, appeared in one of the video squares. Marcus had been with him since the early days, had believed in Mitchell Tech Solutions when it was just David and a laptop, and had grown with the company from administrative assistant to chief operating officer. Boss, I've got the San Francisco logistics finalized. Hotel is wheelchair accessible, meeting room is on the ground floor, and I've arranged for accessible transportation to and from the airport. What about the flight? David asked. That's the thing, Marcus said, his expression troubled. The private jet is in maintenance. Hydraulic issue. They're saying it won't be ready until next week. David felt his stomach tighten. So what are our options? Commercial. I can book first class on United, direct flight from O'Hare to San Francisco. It's not ideal, but it's the best option on short notice. David hesitated. He hated flying commercial, not because of any sense of superiority, but because commercial airlines were unpredictable when it came to accessibility. He'd had his wheelchair damaged more times than he could count. He'd been questioned about whether he could safely fly. He'd dealt with flight attendants who treated him like a liability instead of a passenger. But what choice did he have? "Book it," he said. "First class, 2 seats. I'm bringing Zara." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You're bringing your daughter to a business meeting?" "I'm telling her we're visiting my college friend in San Francisco," David said. "She doesn't need to know about the meeting. This is her fall break from school, and I want her to experience her first flight. I want her to see that we can do normal things, that my wheelchair doesn't stop us from having adventures." There was a long pause. Marcus knew better than most what this really meant. David was trying to create a memory, trying to give his daughter an experience that wasn't about medications and medical appointments. Marcus also knew that David's health was deteriorating, though David refused to acknowledge it. "I'll book the tickets," Marcus finally said. "But David, promise me you'll be careful. Take your medication on schedule, don't push yourself, and if anything feels wrong." I know," David interrupted. "Marcus, I've been managing this condition for 15 years. I've got this." After the call ended, David sat alone in his office for a moment, staring at his hands. The tremor in his left hand had spread to his right. He reached for the bottle of muscle relaxants in his desk drawer, the ones he wasn't supposed to take more than twice a day, and swallowed one dry. The pain was bad today. But it would be fine. It always was. When David told Zara about the trip that evening, her face lit up in a way he hadn't seen in months. They were in the kitchen, Nina stirring a pot of her famous jollof rice, the spicy sweet smell filling the apartment. Zara was doing homework at the kitchen island, her math worksheet covered in careful calculations. "California?" she said, her eyes going wide. "We're going to California?" "Just for a few days," David said, wheeling closer to her. "My friend Thomas lives in San Francisco. I thought it was time you saw the Pacific Ocean." "I've never been on a plane," Zara said, and there was something vulnerable in her voice, a reminder that she was still just a child despite how grown-up she'd had to become. "Is it scary?" "The first time can be," David admitted. "But I'll be right next to you the whole time. And you know what? You're going to love it. When the plane takes off and you see the ground getting smaller and smaller, and then you're up in the clouds looking down at the world, it's like magic." Zara smiled, but then her expression turned serious. "Daddy, will you be okay? On the plane? What if you need something?" And there it was, that constant worry that no 9-year-old should have to carry. David reached out and took her hand. "Baby girl, I will be absolutely fine. I'll have all my medication with me, and planes have flight attendants who are trained to help if anyone needs anything. This is going to be an adventure, okay? A good one." "Promise?" she asked. "I promise," he said, and he meant it. What could possibly go wrong? The next 2 days were a flurry of preparation. Zara researched everything she could about airplanes, filling a notebook with facts about thrust and lift, about how pilots navigate, about what different cloud formations meant. She packed and repacked her small suitcase, making sure Professor Trunks had a spot right on top. She made lists of things to see in San Francisco: the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, Fisherman's Wharf. But she also did something else, something she didn't tell her father about. She took the laminated emergency card from her desk and studied it until she had every word memorized. Then she took out her special phone, the one her father had given her after her mother died, with only 3 numbers programmed. His cell, Marcus's cell, and 911. He told her it was only for emergencies, that she should only use it if something was really, really wrong. Zara held that phone for a long time, sitting on her bed with Professor Trunks in her lap, and she made herself a promise. If her father needed help, if anything went wrong, she wouldn't freeze. She wouldn't be scared. She would do whatever it took to keep him safe. Even if it meant calling 911. Even if it meant talking to strangers. Even if it meant being brave when she was terrified. She didn't know then that she'd have to keep that promise. She didn't know that in 72 hours she'd be sitting in seat 2B of United Flight 2847 with her father struggling to breathe next to her and a flight attendant refusing to help. She didn't know that her 9-year-old voice would end up making national news, sparking congressional hearings, and changing airline policy across the entire country. All she knew was that her father needed her, and she would do anything to protect him. The morning of the flight, Nina made them a big breakfast, eggs and plantains and fresh fruit, though David mostly pushed his food around his plate. Zara noticed but didn't say anything. She'd learned that sometimes pointing out when her father wasn't feeling well just made him more determined to pretend he was fine. Marcus arrived at 9 to drive them to O'Hare International Airport. He loaded David's wheelchair into the trunk with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, then helped David transfer from his everyday chair to the car. Zara climbed into the back seat, her backpack pressed against her chest, professor trunks peeking out from the top. Nina stood at the entrance to their building, waving as they pulled away. "You be good, Zara," she called. "And you take care of yourself." The drive to the airport took 40 minutes in morning traffic. Zara pressed her face against the window, watching Chicago slide past, the gleaming towers of downtown, the sprawling neighborhoods, the industrial areas near the airport. David and Marcus talked business in the front seat, but Zara could hear the strain in her father's voice, could see how he kept shifting in his seat. "You okay, boss?" Marcus asked quietly. "Just stiff from sitting," David said. "I'll be fine once we're on the plane and I can stretch out." They played their usual game during the drive, the one they'd been playing since Zara was tiny. "Cloud story time," David called back to her. "What do you see?" Zara looked up at the sky, at the white clouds drifting across the blue. "I see a dragon," she said. "A friendly one. He's flying to find his family." "What happens when he finds them?" David asked. "They have a big party," Zara said. "And everyone is happy. And nobody gets sick or hurt ever again." There was a long silence in the car. Marcus glanced at David, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. They both understood what Zara was really saying. "That's a good story, baby girl," David finally said. "That's a really good story." O'Hare Airport was chaos, even on a Thursday morning. Marcus pulled up to the departures terminal, got David's wheelchair from the trunk, and helped him transfer. The airport had designated assistance areas, but the curb was crowded with cars and luggage and travelers rushing to make their flights. A security guard blew his whistle at Marcus. "You can't park there." "I'm helping a disabled passenger," Marcus called back. "Don't care, keep it moving." David waved Marcus off. "It's fine, go park. We'll meet you inside." So Marcus drove off to find parking, and David and Zara were left at the curb, surrounded by the rush of people who barely glanced at them. Zara held tight to her father's wheelchair handle with one hand and her backpack with the other. Her heart was pounding. There were so many people, so much noise, so much movement. Her father seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable in the chaos of the airport than he ever did at home or in his office. They made their way inside to the United Airlines check-in counter. The line was long, snaking back and forth between velvet ropes. David wheeled to the front, where there was supposed to be an accessible check-in area, but a businessman in an expensive suit was already there, arguing with the agent about an upgrade. "Excuse me," David said politely. "This is the accessible check-in area." The businessman barely glanced at him. "I'll just be a minute." 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The businessman was now on his phone with someone from the airline's customer service, loudly disputing a charge. David waited patiently, but Zara could see the tightness around his eyes, the way he was gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Finally, the businessman finished and strode off without a word of apology. The check-in agent, a young woman named Rachel according to her name tag, smiled at them. "Hi there. Checking in?" "Yes," David said, providing his confirmation number. Rachel typed into her computer and her expression shifted slightly. It was subtle, just a small flicker of surprise, but both David and Zara caught it. "Oh," she said. "First class. Both of you? Is there a problem?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. No problem at all," Rachel said too brightly. "It's just, well, first-class tickets are quite expensive and I wanted to make sure these were the right reservations." David felt the familiar surge of frustration, the one he'd felt countless times before. The unspoken question hanging in the air, how could a man in a wheelchair afford first-class tickets? "These are the correct reservations," he said. "I purchased them 3 months ago." Of course," Rachel said, typing quickly now. "Let me just verify with my supervisor." "Why do you need to verify?" Zara asked, her voice small but clear. Rachel looked surprised to be questioned by a child. "It's just standard procedure, sweetie." But it wasn't standard procedure and David knew it. He'd flown hundreds of times and he'd never had anyone need to verify his tickets before. This was something else, something uglier. But he kept his voice calm for Zara's sake. "Please just process our check-in. We have a flight to catch." The supervisor came over, an older man who barely looked at David before nodding at Rachel. "They're fine," he said, as if David wasn't sitting right there. As if he needed someone else to confirm that he was allowed to fly first class on a ticket he'd purchased with his own money. Rachel printed their boarding passes and handed them over with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're all set. Have a great flight." As they wheeled away, Zara whispered, "Daddy, why did she act like that?" David wanted to lie, wanted to tell her it was nothing, just a mistake. But he'd promised himself he would never lie to his daughter about the realities of the world. Sometimes people make assumptions about us based on how we look, he said quietly. They see a black man in a wheelchair and they think we don't belong in first class. They think we can't afford it or we're trying to scam the system somehow. But that's not fair, Zara said. No, baby, David said. It's not. But we don't let other people's ignorance change who we are or where we go. We hold our heads high, we prove them wrong by existing exactly as we are, and we keep moving forward. Security was even worse. The TSA checkpoint was crowded, shoes and laptops and liquids piling up in gray bins, agents barking instructions at travelers. David knew the drill by now. He wheeled up to the accessible screening lane and explained to the agent that he couldn't walk through the metal detector, that he'd need to be screened in his wheelchair. The TSA agent, a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, looked David up and down. You can't stand at all? No, David said. I have a complete spinal cord injury. You got documentation of that? David felt his patience fraying. I don't carry around documentation of my disability. I have a wheelchair. That's generally considered sufficient evidence. Don't get smart with me, sir, the agent said. I need you to stand for the metal detector. I just told you I can't stand, David said, his voice tight. Look, I don't make the rules. Actually, you do know the rules, David interrupted. The TSA has specific protocols for screening passengers with disabilities. I can be screened in my wheelchair, or you can take me to a private room for a pat-down. Those are the options. The agent's face reddened. Wait here, he said and walked off to get a supervisor. Zara stood next to her father, watching as other passengers moved through security easily, as people stared at them as the line backed up behind them. She felt the heat of embarrassment, of anger, of helplessness. Her father had done nothing wrong. He was just trying to catch a flight the same as everyone else. Why did it have to be so hard? The supervisor finally came, a woman who seemed more knowledgeable, and she apologized for the delay and escorted David to a separate screening area. The pat-down was invasive and humiliating, conducted in full view of everyone in the security line. They tested his wheelchair for explosive residue. They made him remove his shoes, even though he'd explained he had limited use of his hands and it would take several minutes. They questioned the medication in his carry-on bag, making him explain each prescription. Through it all, David remained calm and patient, answering every question, complying with every request. But Zara could see what it cost him, could see the sweat beading on his forehead, could see the way his hands shook when he finally put his shoes back on. By the time they cleared security, 35 minutes had passed and David looked exhausted. Marcus had found them by then, and he took over pushing the wheelchair, giving David a chance to rest. This is exactly why I told you to take the private jet, Marcus muttered. It's fine, David said, but his voice was strained. We're through security. The hard part's over. Except it wasn't. Not even close. They made their way through the terminal to gate B-17. The gate area was already crowded with passengers waiting to board. David scanned the area and his stomach sank. There were no accessible seating options, just rows of attached chairs with armrests that made it impossible for a wheelchair to pull up. He'd have to wait in the open area in everyone's way, or position himself off to the side where he couldn't hear the boarding announcements. He chose a spot near the windows where Zara could watch the planes and where they'd be out of the main flow of foot traffic. Marcus stayed with them, checking his watch, making work calls, handling the 1,000 details that made David's life run smoothly. Zara pressed her face against the glass, watching planes taxi and take off, her excitement momentarily overriding the stress of the morning. Look, Daddy. That one's going up. David smiled despite his exhaustion. This was what he wanted, these moments of childhood wonder. This was why he pushed himself so hard, why he refused to let his disability dictate his choices. For her. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. United Flight 2847 with service to San Francisco will begin boarding shortly. We ask that passengers requiring additional time or assistance, including those traveling with small children or those who need wheelchair assistance, please come to the podium at this time. David wheeled toward the gate. The gate agent was a young man named Tyler, according to his name tag, and he looked up from his computer with a friendly smile. Hi there. You're flying to San Francisco? Yes, David said, showing his boarding pass. First class, seats 2A and 2B. Tyler scanned the passes. Great. We'll have you board during our pre-boarding in just a few minutes. Will you need any assistance transferring to your seat? No, David said. I can transfer myself. I just need help getting my wheelchair stored. Absolutely, Tyler said. I'll make sure the crew knows. It was such a small thing being treated with basic courtesy and professionalism, but after the morning they'd had, it felt like a gift. David felt himself relax slightly. Maybe the rest of the trip would be smooth. Maybe he'd been worried for nothing. Marcus pulled him aside while they waited. You've got all your medication in your carry-on? Yes, everything, David said. And you remember the timing? The blood pressure medication at noon, the muscle relaxant. Marcus, I've got this, David said. Stop worrying. Someone has to worry since you won't, Marcus said. But he hugged David, then crouched down to hug Zara. You take care of your dad, okay? I always do, Zara said seriously. I know you do, kiddo. I know you do. The pre-boarding announcement came, and David and Zara made their way down the jet bridge. It was narrow, barely wide enough for his wheelchair, and David had to navigate carefully to avoid scraping the walls. Zara walked beside him, one hand resting on his armrest, her backpack bouncing with each step. At the aircraft door, 2 flight attendants were waiting. One was a young man with kind eyes and an easy smile. His name tag read Kevin. The other was a woman in her 50s, blonde hair pulled back tight, makeup perfect, posture rigid. Her name tag read Diane. Kevin stepped forward immediately. Welcome aboard. Let me help you with that wheelchair. But Diane stepped in front of him, her eyes scanning David and Zara with an expression that David had learned to recognize over the years. Judgment. Assumption. Dismissal. Seats? She asked, her voice clipped. 2A and 2B, David said. First class. Something flickered across Diane's face. Surprise. Skepticism. She took the boarding passes from David's hand and scanned them with her handheld device, then scanned them again. These are first-class seats, she said as if David didn't know. Yes, David said, keeping his voice level. Is there a problem? No problem, Diane said, but her tone said otherwise. It's just that these seats are usually reserved for our premier executive members. Kevin looked uncomfortable. Diane, the seats are assigned. If that's what his boarding pass says, I'm aware of how boarding passes work, Kevin, Diane snapped. Then she looked back at David, and her expression softened into something that was supposed to be a smile but looked more like a grimace. Of course you're welcome in first class. Right this way. She didn't offer to help. She didn't step aside to give David room to maneuver. She just turned and walked into the aircraft, leaving David to navigate the narrow aisle on his own while other passengers boarding behind them grew impatient. Kevin moved to help, but David waved him off. He'd been doing this long enough to know that accepting help from the junior flight attendant would only make the senior one more hostile. He maneuvered his wheelchair through the aircraft door and into the first-class cabin. Seats 2A and 2B were on the left side, just behind first-class bulkhead. Perfect location, plenty of legroom, exactly what David had paid extra for. He set the wheelchair brake and began the process of transferring to the seat, something he'd done thousands times. Slide forward in the chair, position his arms on the seat armrests, use his upper body strength to lift himself across. It was harder than usual today. His arms were shaking from fatigue and pain, and it took 3 attempts before he successfully transferred. Zara hovered anxiously the whole time, ready to help but not sure how. Daddy, are you okay? I'm fine, baby girl, David said, though he was breathing hard from the effort. Just tired? Come on, get in your seat. Zara climbed into 2B next to the window, clutching Professor Trunks. David's wheelchair was still in the aisle, and Kevin immediately moved to take it. I'll get this stored for you, sir. But Diane was there again, inserting herself into the situation. We'll need to store that in the cargo hold. No, David said sharply. This was non-negotiable. His wheelchair was custom-made, worth $40,000 and irreplaceable. My wheelchair stays in the cabin. It can be stored in the front closet or, if that's full, in the space behind the last row. Those are the standard procedures for mobility devices. The closet is full, Diane said. Then store it in the back, David said. That space is for crew equipment. David felt his frustration building. The Air Carrier Access Act requires that wheelchairs be stored in the cabin when possible. My wheelchair is a medical device. It doesn't go in cargo. Diane's expression hardened. Sir, I understand that you're accustomed to special treatment, but I have procedures to follow. If the cabin storage is full. It's not about special treatment, David interrupted, his voice rising slightly. It's about federal law. Kevin jumped in, trying to defuse the situation. Diane, we can make room in the back. It's not a problem. For a long moment, Diane stared at David and he stared back, neither backing down. Then, finally, she smiled that fake smile again. Of course. Kevin, take care of it. Kevin wheeled the chair toward the back of the plane, and Diane moved to the front of the cabin to greet the other first-class passengers who were now boarding. David watched her, his jaw tight. He knew that look, that tone. This wasn't over. Zara reached for his hand. Daddy, I don't like her. I know, baby, David said quietly. But we're going to be fine. We're going to get through this flight, get to San Francisco, and have a great trip. Okay. Okay, Zara said, but she didn't sound convinced. Neither was David. Because as the other first-class passengers boarded, as they settled into their seats with champagne and warm towels and complimentary amenities, as Diane greeted them with genuine smiles and warmth, David saw the difference in treatment. He saw the way she laughed at the businessman's joke in 1A. He saw the way she helped the elderly couple in 3C and 3D with their carry-on bags. He saw the way she walked past him and Zara without acknowledgement, without eye contact, as if they weren't there. The plane pushed back from the gate and began to taxi toward the runway. Zara's hand found her father's, and she held on tight as the engines roared to life. The acceleration pressed them back into their seats, and then they were lifting, the ground falling away beneath them. Zara's face was pressed to the window, her eyes wide with wonder. Daddy, look. We're flying. We're actually flying. David smiled, watching his daughter's joy, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The pain, the frustration, the humiliation of the morning, none of it mattered. Because his baby girl was experiencing something magical, and he was there to share it with her. But that moment didn't last long. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Diane appeared in the aisle with her beverage cart. She worked her way down the cabin, all smiles and pleasant conversation with the other passengers. When she reached row 1, she spent several minutes chatting with the businessman about his work, laughing at his stories, recommending the salmon for lunch. Then she reached row 2. Her smile disappeared. What can I get for you folks? She said, her tone flat and impersonal, the word folks carrying just the slightest edge of condescension. I'll have a glass of red wine, David said. And she'll have apple juice. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. Sir, I need to ask, with your condition, should you be drinking alcohol? It might interact with your medications. David felt his jaw tighten. This was crossing a line. My medical decisions are between me and my doctor. I'd like a glass of red wine. I'm just concerned for your safety, Diane said, with fake concern dripping from every word. I wouldn't want there to be an incident. There won't be an incident, David said, his voice hard now. There will, however, be a violation of my rights if you continue to discriminate against me based on my disability. Diane's face flushed. I'm not discriminating. I'm following safety protocols. You didn't ask anyone else about their medical conditions before serving them alcohol, David pointed out. You're singling me out because I'm in a wheelchair. Kevin appeared from the galley, sensing the tension. Diane, I can take over here if you need to. I've got it, Diane snapped. She poured a glass of wine with jerky, angry movements and practically slammed it down on David's tray table, liquid sloshing over the rim. Then she poured apple juice for Zara without a word and moved on to the next row, all warmth and smiles returning as if nothing had happened. Zara stared at the wine spreading across the tray table. Daddy, why is she being so mean to us? David grabbed a napkin and mopped up the spill, his hands shaking slightly. Not just from anger now but from pain. The stress of the morning, the confrontation, the transfer to the seat, it was all taking a toll. He could feel the familiar tightness building in his chest, the warning signs that his body was approaching its limit. Some people, he said quietly, carry prejudice in their hearts. They see someone who looks different, who moves differently, and they decide that person is less than. It's not about us, baby. It's about something broken in them. But you're not less than, Zara said fiercely. You're the smartest, strongest person I know. David's eyes filled with tears that he blinked away quickly. Thank you, baby girl. That means everything to me. He took a sip of wine, hoping it might help him relax, might ease some of the tension coiled tight in his shoulders. But instead it seemed to make things worse. The tightness in his chest increased. His left hand began to tremble more noticeably. He shifted in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position, but the pain was spreading now, radiating through his back and down his legs. Zara noticed immediately. She'd been watching for these signs for 2 years now. Daddy? Do you need your medicine? Not yet, David said, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He needed his medication now. The muscle relaxant, the blood pressure pill, he was already 30 minutes past when he should have taken them. But asking for his medication meant getting his bag down from the overhead compartment, meant drawing more attention to himself, meant giving Diane another opportunity to make him feel small. He'd wait. Just a little longer. Until they were at cruising altitude and things had settled down. 30 minutes passed. The tightness in David's chest became pressure. The tremor in his hands spread to his arms. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Zara unbuckled her seatbelt. "Daddy, I'm getting your medicine." "Zara, sit down," David said, but his voice came out weak and strained. "You need it," she said, and there was no arguing with the determination in her voice. She'd seen her mother die. She wasn't going to watch her father suffer if she could help it. She stood and reached for the overhead compartment, but she was too short. She looked around for help and Kevin was walking past heading toward the galley. "Excuse me," Zara said. "Can you help me get my dad's bag? He needs his medicine." Kevin's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Of course, sweetheart. Which one is it?" Zara pointed to the black medical bag and Kevin pulled it down and handed it to her. "Is your dad okay?" "He will be once he takes his medicine," Zara said with a confidence she didn't feel. She returned to her seat and unzipped the bag, pulling out the medication organizer. But before she could hand anything to her father, Diane appeared in the aisle. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "My daddy needs his medicine," Zara said. Diane looked at David, at his pale face and shaking hands, and instead of concern, her expression showed suspicion. "What kind of medicine?" "Prescription medication," David managed to say. "For my condition." "I'll need to verify those," Diane said, reaching for the bag. David tried to pull it away but his hands weren't working properly. "They're prescribed. The bottles have my name on them." "Sir, I have a responsibility to ensure the safety of all passengers on this aircraft," Diane said, her voice taking on an official tone. "I cannot allow you to take unverified medications that could cause a medical emergency." "Not taking them is going to cause a medical emergency," David said, his breathing becoming more labored. But Diane had already taken the bag. "I need to inspect these. I'll be right back." "No," David said, trying to stand, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't, his body jerking uselessly. "You can't take my medication. That's illegal." "I'll return it once I've verified everything," Diane said, and she walked toward the galley with the bag. Zara stood up, her small body shaking with anger and fear. "Give it back. He needs it now." But Diane was already gone, disappearing behind the galley curtain. Kevin stood frozen for a moment, clearly torn between following the senior flight attendant's lead and doing what was obviously right. Then he made his decision. "I'm getting the captain," he said and hurried toward the cockpit. David slumped in his seat, his breathing now coming in short, painful gasps. The pressure in his chest had become crushing. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. This was autonomic dysreflexia, exactly what Dr. Okonkwo had warned him about. His body was in crisis, his blood pressure spiking dangerously, and without his medication it could lead to a stroke or worse. "Daddy?" Zara's voice was small and scared now. "Daddy, stay with me." "I'm okay, baby," David whispered, but they both knew it was a lie. Zara looked toward the galley, where Diane had disappeared with the medication bag. She looked at her father, getting worse with every passing second. She looked at the other passengers, some of whom were starting to notice something was wrong but none of whom were helping. And then she reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. The special phone with only 3 numbers. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked it. She'd made herself a promise back in Chicago, that if her father needed help, she would be brave. It was time to keep that promise. She dialed 911. The line rang once. Twice. Then a voice. 911, what's your emergency? My daddy can't breathe right, Zara said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We're on an airplane and the flight lady took his medicine and won't give it back and he's getting really sick. There was a pause. Sweetie, did you say you're on an airplane? Yes, Zara said. United Flight 2847. We're going to San Francisco but we haven't got there yet. We're in the sky. Okay honey, stay calm. I'm going to transfer you to my supervisor who handles this kind of emergency. Can you stay on the line? Yes, Zara said. She looked at her father, whose eyes were closed now, his head tilted back against the seat. Please hurry. Another voice came on the line, older and more authoritative. This is Supervisor Williams. You're calling from an airplane? Yes, ma'am, Zara said. My name is Zara Mitchell. I'm 9 years old. My daddy's name is David Mitchell and he has a spinal cord injury and he takes medicine every day and the flight attendant took his medicine away and now he can't breathe right and his hands are shaking really bad and I'm scared. Okay Zara, you're doing great. You're very brave to call. I need some information. What airline and what's the flight number? Zara grabbed the safety card from the seat pocket. United Airlines. Flight 2847. And you said you're going to San Francisco? Where did you leave from? Chicago. We left from Chicago. Okay, I'm looking at the flight path now. You're over Nebraska right now. Zara, is your father conscious? Can he talk to me? Zara held the phone up to her father's face. Daddy? The 911 lady wants to talk to you. David's eyes fluttered open. Zara, shouldn't have called. Sir, this is 911 emergency services. Can you describe your symptoms? David tried to focus. Chest pressure. Can't breathe. Hands, tremors. Blood pressure, too high. Need medication. What medication do you need, sir? Bag, David gasped. Black bag. Flight attendant took it. The flight attendant took your medication? Supervisor Williams's voice sharpened. Is she aware this is a medical emergency? At that moment, Kevin returned with Captain Rodriguez, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver hair and an air of calm authority. Behind them, Diane followed, still clutching the black medical bag. Captain Rodriguez took one look at David and immediately understood the severity of the situation. Where's his medication? I have it, Diane said. I was just verifying. Give it to him. Now. The captain's voice left no room for argument. But I haven't finished inspecting. I don't care. Captain Rodriguez took the bag from Diane's hands and gave it to Zara. Get him what he needs. Zara was still on the phone with 911. The captain is here now. He gave us the medicine back. Okay, good, Supervisor Williams said. But Zara, don't hang up yet. I want to make sure your father is okay. I'm also contacting air traffic control to see if we need to divert this flight for an emergency landing. Zara pulled out the medication organizer with shaking hands. She'd done this 1,000 times at home, but never like this, never with her father barely conscious and a plane full of strangers watching. She found the right pills, the blue one for blood pressure, the white one for muscle spasms, and she held them up to her father's lips. Daddy, take these, she said. David managed to get them in his mouth and Kevin appeared with a bottle of water. It took 3 tries for David to swallow the pills, but finally they went down. He took the medicine, Zara reported to the 911 operator. Good. Now we wait and see if he improves. How does he look? Zara studied her father's face. He was still pale, still sweating, but his breathing seemed slightly less labored. Maybe a little better? I don't know. Captain Rodriguez crouched down next to David's seat. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Captain Rodriguez. We're about 45 minutes from Denver. I can make an emergency landing there and have paramedics waiting. Do you need me to do that? David shook his head weakly. Give it a few minutes. Medication should help. Sir, with all due respect, you look like you're having a medical crisis, the captain said. Autonomic dysreflexia, David managed. I've had it before. Medication should work. The captain looked at Zara, this tiny 9-year-old girl still on the phone with 911, still holding her father's hand, still being braver than most adults could manage. Young lady, you did exactly the right thing calling for help. I promised I would, Zara said. I promised I'd keep him safe. The captain stood and turned to Diane, and his expression was no longer calm. It was ice-cold fury barely contained. My office. After we land. You're suspended effective immediately. I was following protocols, Diane started. You withheld medication from a passenger having a medical emergency, Captain Rodriguez said, his voice cutting. There is no protocol that justifies that. Kevin, you're senior attendant for the rest of this flight. Make sure Mr. Mitchell has everything he needs. Yes, sir, Kevin said. The captain pulled out his phone and made a call. This is Captain Rodriguez on United 2847. I need you to contact Denver Ground Operations. We may need an emergency landing. I'll update in 10 minutes. He disconnected and spoke into his phone again. I also need legal and passenger services standing by. We have a potential civil rights violation in progress. Zara was still on the phone with Supervisor Williams, who'd heard everything. Zara, how is your father doing now? Zara looked at her dad. His eyes were open now, more focused than before. His breathing was deeper, more regular. The sweat on his forehead was starting to dry. I think he's getting better. That's good. That's very good. Zara, I want you to know that what you did today was incredibly brave. You might have saved your father's life. I just did what I had to do, Zara said. That's what heroes say, Supervisor Williams said gently. Now, I'm going to stay on the line a bit longer, but I'm also going to contact the FAA and the FBI. The FBI? Zara asked. When there's a serious incident on an airplane, especially one involving discrimination and denial of medical care, it becomes a federal matter. What that flight attendant did was illegal. She's going to face consequences. Zara looked over at Diane, who was standing near the galley, her face pale, her hands shaking. For a moment, Zara almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then she looked at her father, still recovering from a crisis that never should have happened, and she felt nothing but anger. Over the next 30 minutes, David's condition steadily improved. The medication had done its job, bringing his blood pressure down, stopping the tremors, easing the pain. He was exhausted and shaken, but he was going to be okay. Captain Rodriguez made several more announcements to the passengers, apologizing for the disturbance and assuring everyone that the situation was under control. He never mentioned David by name, but everyone in first class knew what had happened. The businessman in 1A had filmed part of the confrontation on his phone. The elderly couple in 3C had witnessed the whole thing. Word spread through the cabin like wildfire. When they finally landed in San Francisco, fire trucks and ambulances were waiting on the tarmac. Captain Rodriguez had decided to request a medical team as a precaution, even though David insisted he was fine. The plane taxied to the gate, and the captain made one more announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Medical personnel will be boarding to attend to a passenger. Also, 2 FBI agents will be boarding to conduct an investigation. If any of you witnessed the incident involving the passenger in 2A and the flight attendant, please identify yourselves to the agents. Thank you for your patience. The doors opened and paramedics rushed on board. They found David sitting upright, holding his daughter's hand, looking tired but stable. They checked his vital signs, asked questions about his condition and his medication, and ultimately agreed that he didn't need to be transported to the hospital. But I'd recommend following up with your doctor as soon as possible, one of the paramedics said. What you experienced was serious. You're lucky your daughter knew what to do. I know, David said, pulling Zara close. I'm the luckiest father in the world. The FBI agents were next, a man and a woman in dark suits with serious expressions. They spoke briefly with Captain Rodriguez, then approached David. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Santos and this is Agent Liu. We need to get your statement about what happened on this flight. David nodded. I'll tell you everything. But first, I need you to understand something. My daughter was the one who called 911. She was the one who refused to let this situation continue. If you're going to investigate anyone, investigate why a 9-year-old child had to be the only person brave enough to stand up for what was right. Agent Santos crouched down to Zara's level. Is it true you called 911? Yes, ma'am, Zara said. My daddy needed help and the flight lady wouldn't give him his medicine. That was very brave of you, Agent Liu said. And very smart. You did exactly the right thing. Over the next hour, while other passengers deplaned and went about their travels, David and Zara stayed on the aircraft, giving their statements. The businessman from 1A came forward with his video. The elderly couple from 3C provided witness statements. Even some passengers from economy class, who'd heard about what happened, came forward to say they'd experienced similar treatment from Diane on previous flights. Kevin, the junior flight attendant, gave a statement too. I've been flying with Diane for 8 months, he said. This isn't the first time I've seen her treat passengers with disabilities differently. She always finds some excuse, some policy she claims to be following, but it's discrimination. Plain and simple. Diane herself was questioned in the cockpit by the FBI agents. Through the closed door, Zara could hear her voice rising and falling, defensive and angry. I was following safety protocols. I had no way of knowing, he was being difficult. The child was disruptive. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video. The witness statements. The 911 recording. The captain's report. There was no talking her way out of this. Finally, the agents finished their preliminary investigation. Mr. Mitchell will be in touch for follow-up questions, but you're free to go. We've arranged for a wheelchair-accessible vehicle to take you to your hotel. What happens to her? Zara asked, pointing toward the cockpit. She'll be escorted off the plane by airport security, Agent Santos said. She's being terminated from her position and will likely face federal charges for violating the Air Carrier Access Act, among other things. Good, Zara said fiercely. She She hurt my daddy. Yes, she did, Agent Lou said. And because you were brave enough to speak up, she's going to face consequences. More importantly, your actions might prevent this from happening to someone else. As they finally left the aircraft, supported by airline personnel who couldn't apologize enough, David felt the weight of everything that had happened settling on his shoulders. The humiliation, the pain, the fear, but also the pride. His daughter had saved him. His 9-year-old daughter had done what needed to be done when adults had failed. Marcus was waiting for them at the gate, having heard about the emergency through the airline's customer service. He took one look at David's face and pulled him into a hug. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." "I'll try not to," David said. "And you," Marcus said, turning to Zara. "You're a superhero. You know that, right?" Zara just buried her face in Professor Trunk's. Now that the crisis was over, now that her father was safe, the reality of what she'd done was hitting her. She'd called 911. She'd stood up to adults. She'd made a scene on an airplane. All the training she'd had about being quiet and polite and not causing trouble had gone out the window when her father's life was on the line. "Did I do the right thing?" she asked quietly. David tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "Baby girl, you did the most right thing anyone has ever done. You saw an injustice, you saw someone you love in danger, and you didn't wait for permission to act. You just acted. That's courage. That's strength. That's everything I've ever wanted you to learn." "But people were staring," Zara said. "And that lady Diane, she looked so scared at the end." "Good," David said. "She should be scared. She abused her power. She discriminated against someone because of their disability. She put someone's life at risk because of her prejudice. Fear of consequences is the only thing that's going to make people like her think twice before treating someone else the way she treated us." They made their way through the terminal, Marcus pushing David's wheelchair now, Zara walking close beside them. Other travelers stared, some with curiosity, some with sympathy. A few approached to say they'd heard what happened and to offer support. One woman, a black woman probably in her 60s, stopped them near baggage claim. "I heard about what happened on your flight. I just want to say thank you for standing up. I've flown hundreds of times, and I've been treated like I don't belong more times than I can count. Maybe now things will change." "Maybe," David said. "I hope so." Outside the airport, an accessible van was waiting for them. As they drove toward the hotel, Zara pressed her face against the window, watching San Francisco appear in the distance. The Golden Gate Bridge rising through the fog. The hills covered in pastel houses. The water glittering in the late afternoon sun. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," David agreed. "We're going to have a good trip, baby. Despite everything, we're going to make good memories here." And they did. Over the next 2 days, while David conducted his business meetings, Marcus took Zara to all the places on her list. They rode the cable cars. They visited Alcatraz. They walked along Fisherman's Wharf and watched the sea lions. They ate too much sourdough bread and drank hot chocolate while watching the fog roll in over the bay. But even as they made these memories, even as they tried to move on, the incident on the plane was spreading. The businessman who'd filmed the confrontation had posted his video online. Within 24 hours, it had 3 million views. Within 48 hours, it was trending on every social media platform. The comments section was a mix of outrage and support. "This is absolutely unacceptable. That little girl is braver than most adults. United Airlines needs to be held accountable. This is why we need stronger disability rights laws. I'm never flying United again until they fix this." News outlets picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they all ran segments about the 9-year-old girl who called 911 at 30,000 feet to save her father from discrimination. Disability rights organizations issued statements demanding change. Celebrities shared the story. Politicians weighed in. David tried to shield Zara from most of it, but she saw some of it anyway. She saw herself on television, her small voice describing what had happened to her father. She heard commentators debating whether she'd done the right thing, whether calling 911 had been appropriate or an overreaction. "Am I in trouble?" she asked her father one evening as they sat in their hotel room. "No, baby. You're not in trouble. You're a hero. But some people on TV said I shouldn't have called 911. They said it was for real emergencies." "It was a real emergency," David said firmly. "I was having a medical crisis. That flight attendant had taken my medication and refused to give it back. If you hadn't called, if we'd waited even 10 more minutes, I could have had a stroke. You calling 911 was absolutely the right decision, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't understand what actually happened." On the third day of their trip, United Airlines requested a meeting. Not with lawyers, not with low-level customer service managers, but with the CEO himself. David agreed, but only on his terms. The meeting would be at his hotel. It would be recorded. And Zara would be present for part of it. Robert Chin, the attorney who'd been on the flight and had witnessed everything, offered to represent David pro bono. "What happened to you and your daughter was a violation of federal law," he said. "United Airlines is legally liable. We could sue them for millions. But I have a feeling you want something more than money." "You're right," David said. "I want change. Real systemic change. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The meeting took place in a conference room at the hotel. United CEO James Patterson arrived with his legal team and his head of customer experience. He was a tall white man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished corporate presence that usually projected confidence and control. But today he looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell," he said, nodding to both David and Zara, "I want to start by offering my sincerest apologies for what happened on your flight. The treatment you received was completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values of United Airlines." "With respect, Mr. Patterson, it does reflect your values," David said. "Because this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern. There are dozens of complaints filed against United every year by disabled passengers. Your company has been fined multiple times for Air Carrier Access Act violations. So when you say this doesn't reflect your values, what you really mean is this doesn't reflect the values you wish you had." Patterson's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "You're right. We have a systemic problem and we haven't done enough to address it." "So let's talk about how you're going to address it now," David said. What followed was a negotiation that would change the landscape of airline accessibility. David, with Robert Chen's guidance, presented a comprehensive plan. Mandatory disability awareness training for all United employees, not just a one-time seminar but ongoing education. A complete revision of medical accommodation policies. An independent oversight committee that would include disabled advocates and passengers. A passenger bill of rights specifically for disabled travelers. Significant financial investment in accessibility improvements across United's fleet. And Diane needs to be terminated and barred from working in the airline industry, David added. What she did wasn't just a mistake or poor judgment. It was deliberate discrimination that put my life at risk. "She's already been terminated," Patterson said. "And we're supporting the federal investigation that will likely result in criminal charges." "Good," David said. "But that's not enough. I want United to create a scholarship fund in Zara's name. The Mitchell Accessibility Scholarship. For disabled students pursuing careers in aviation, aerospace and transportation. $1 million annually." Patterson didn't even hesitate. "Done." "I also want United to fund a larger initiative," David continued. "The Mitchell Foundation for Disability Justice and Youth Empowerment. Not 1 million. 10 million. To support disabled individuals facing discrimination, to provide legal advocacy, to fund research on accessibility, and to empower young people to speak up when they see injustice." Now Patterson did pause. $10 million was significant even for a major airline. But he was also looking at potential lawsuits, federal investigations, and a PR nightmare that was costing them millions in lost business already. "We'll do it," he said. "But we want to be clear that this is not an admission of liability. This is United Airlines committing to being part of the solution." "Call it whatever you want," David said. "As long as the check clears." They signed a preliminary agreement that day, with full contracts to be finalized over the following weeks. But before the meeting ended, Patterson asked if he could speak to Zara. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his formal tone sounding strange applied to a 9-year-old. "What you did on that flight took remarkable courage. You saw a problem and you didn't wait for adults to fix it. You fixed it yourself. That's leadership. That's advocacy. I hope you'll consider a career in aviation when you grow up. We could use people like you." Zara looked at him with the serious, evaluating gaze she'd inherited from her father. "I'm going to be an astronaut," she said. "And a disability rights lawyer. Maybe both. I haven't decided yet." Patterson smiled. "I have no doubt you'll be successful at whatever you choose." After they left, David held his daughter close. "I'm so proud of you. You know that, right?" "You keep saying that," Zara said. "But I just did what anyone would do." "No, baby. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have been too scared or too worried about making a scene or too conditioned to accept mistreatment as normal. You refused to accept it. You saw an injustice and you fought back. That's not common. That's extraordinary. The rest of their trip was quieter. They visited David's college friend who turned out to be quite real. They walked through Golden Gate Park. They ate dim sum in Chinatown. They rode the ferry to Sausalito and back. And slowly, the weight of what had happened began to lift, replaced by the simple joy of a father and daughter experiencing the world together. On their last night in San Francisco, they sat on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Zara was quiet, more reflective than usual. "Daddy," she finally said, "why do people treat us different?" David thought carefully before answering. He'd known this conversation would come eventually, but he'd hoped to have more time to prepare. "You know how we talked about assumptions?" he said. "How people sometimes make judgments based on what they see on the outside?" Zara nodded. "Well, there are a lot of reasons people do that. Sometimes it's ignorance, they just don't know better because they've never had to think about disability or race or anything that makes people different. Sometimes it's fear, they're scared of what they don't understand. Sometimes it's something deeper and uglier, prejudice that's been taught to them or that they've developed because it makes them feel superior. But here's what you need to understand, baby girl. Their assumptions, their prejudices, their ignorance, none of that has anything to do with our worth. We are valuable because we're human. Because we love and we work and we contribute and we exist. We don't have to prove ourselves to anyone. But we do prove ourselves," Zara said. "You prove yourself every day. You built a whole company. You help thousands of people. You make millions of dollars. Doesn't that prove you belong?" "In some ways," David said. "But that's the trap, you see. If we only belong because of our accomplishments, then what about disabled people who can't work? What about people who aren't billionaires? Do they belong less? Are they worth less?" Zara frowned, thinking about it. "No, that doesn't seem right." "It's not right," David agreed. "Everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their bank account or their job title or what their body can or can't do. That's what I want you to learn from this experience. Not that you have to be exceptional to matter, but that you matter because you exist. And when someone tries to tell you different, when someone tries to treat you as less than, you fight back. Not with anger or violence, but with courage and conviction. Just like you did on that plane." "I was scared," Zara admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," David said. "It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway." They flew home a few days later on a different airline. David had made it clear he wouldn't fly United again until he could verify that the promised changes had been implemented. The return flight was uneventful, almost boring in its normalcy. The flight attendants were professional and kind. David's medication stayed in his possession. Nobody questioned their right to be in first class. But even as they landed back in Chicago, even as they returned to their normal routines, both of them knew that nothing would ever be quite normal again. The story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets were still covering it. Disability rights organizations were using their experience to push for legislative changes. Other airlines were scrambling to review their own policies before they became the next United Airlines. Within a week of their return, David received a call from a congressional staffer. Representative Jameson, who chaired the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, wanted to hold hearings on airline accessibility. She wanted David and Zara to testify. "Absolutely not," was David's initial response. "My daughter has been through enough. I'm not putting her in front of cameras again." But Zara surprised him. "I want to do it," she said. "If it helps, if it makes things better for other people, I want to do it." So 6 weeks after the incident, David and Zara found themselves in Washington, D.C., sitting at a table in a congressional hearing room, facing a panel of representatives and a room full of cameras. David gave his testimony first, describing in detail what had happened, the discrimination, the denial of medical care, the fear and humiliation. "But I want to be clear," he said as he concluded. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one airline. This is about a system that consistently fails disabled people. We face barriers at every stage of air travel. From websites that aren't accessible, to airport security that treats us as threats, to aircraft that aren't designed with our needs in mind, to staff who receive inadequate training on disability rights. What happened to me and my daughter was extreme, but the underlying attitudes and systemic failures are common." Then it was Zara's turn. She prepared a statement with her father's help, but when she got up to the microphone, she spoke from her heart instead. "My name is Zara Mitchell. I'm 9 years old. I called 911 on an airplane because a flight attendant took my daddy's medicine and wouldn't give it back and he was getting really sick. I was scared. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. But I knew I had to do something because nobody else was helping. She paused, looking at the representatives, at the cameras, at the disability rights advocates filling the gallery. My teacher says that when you see something wrong you should tell an adult. But what do you do when the adults are the ones doing something wrong? I think that's why a lot of people don't speak up. They think, well, these are grown-ups, they must know what they're doing. But sometimes grown-ups are wrong. Sometimes they treat people badly because of what they look like or because they use a wheelchair or for other reasons that don't make sense. My daddy always tells me that our value doesn't come from what our bodies can do. It comes from what our hearts choose to do. The flight attendant lady, her body worked fine, she could walk and stand and do everything. But her heart chose to be mean and unfair. My daddy's legs don't work, but his heart chooses to be kind and to help people and to build things that make the world better. I don't think airlines need better rules about wheelchairs and medicine. I mean, they do need those things. But mostly I think people need better hearts. They need to see someone different from them and think, that's a person who deserves respect, instead of, that's a problem I need to deal with. She looked directly at the camera, at the millions of people who would eventually watch this testimony. If you're watching this and you have a disability or if you love someone who does, I want you to know something. You belong everywhere. On airplanes, in first class, in stores, in schools, everywhere. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't. And if they try, you speak up. You call 911 if you have to. You tell someone. You fight back. Because you matter. You matter so much. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Representative Jameson, a usually stoic woman known for her tough questioning, wiped at her eyes. Ms. Mitchell, she said. That was one of the most powerful testimonies I've heard in 20 years in Congress. Thank you for your courage. The hearings led to new legislation, the Mitchell Act as it became known informally. It strengthened the Air Carrier Access Act, increased penalties for violations, created better enforcement mechanisms, and provided funding for improved accessibility across the aviation industry. It passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law 6 months later. David and Zara were invited to the signing ceremony at the White House. As they stood behind the president while he signed the bill into law, Zara thought about how strange life was. 6 months ago, she'd been a normal fourth grader who loved robotics and astronomy. Now she was a national figure in disability rights, standing in the White House watching a law named after her family become real. What are you thinking about? Her father whispered. I'm thinking about Mom, Zara whispered back. I wish she could see this. She can, David said. I believe that. And I believe she's proud of you. Just like I am. Life gradually returned to a new kind of normal after that. Zara went back to school, where she was treated like a celebrity for a while before eventually just becoming one of the kids again. David continued running Mitchell Tech Solutions, though he made accessibility and disability advocacy a core part of the company's mission. The Mitchell Foundation launched with its $10 million from United Airlines and quickly raised millions more from other donors who'd been inspired by Zara's story. A year after the incident, Zara was invited to speak at her school's annual assembly. She stood on the stage in the gymnasium, looking out at hundreds of students and teachers, and she told her story. Not the dramatic version that had been on the news, but the real version. The fear, the uncertainty, the moment when she'd had to choose between following the rules and doing what was right. I learned something that day on the airplane, she said. I learned that being young doesn't mean being powerless. I learned that speaking up is scary, but staying quiet when someone needs help is scarier. I learned that one person, even a 9-year-old person, can make a difference. But I also learned that I shouldn't have had to make that call. The system should have protected my dad. The flight attendant should have treated him with dignity. The other passengers should have spoken up sooner. I learned that change is important, but it's not just about laws and policies. It's about people choosing to be better, to be kinder, to see the humanity in everyone they meet. After the assembly, several students approached her. One was a boy in a wheelchair who said he'd been afraid to join the robotics club because he thought it would be too hard. But if you can call 911 on an airplane, he said, I guess I can ask to join a club. Another was a girl who said her grandmother had diabetes and was afraid to travel because of past experiences with airlines. I'm going to tell her about your story, she said. Maybe it'll help her feel brave enough to visit us. These conversations, these small moments of connection and inspiration, meant more to Zara than any award or news coverage. Because this was what change looked like at the ground level. Not grand gestures or historic legislation, but individual people feeling empowered to claim their space in the world. 2 years after the incident, on a fall day much like the one when they'd first flown to San Francisco, David and Zara stood in an airport again. But this time, They were there for the opening of the United Airlines Accessibility Center at O'Hare, a state-of-the-art facility designed to serve disabled travelers. It had private spaces for medication management, accessible bathrooms with full assist features, sensory quiet rooms for travelers with autism or anxiety disorders, and staff specifically trained in disability services. "This is pretty cool," Zara said, now 11 years old and somehow even more confident than before. "It is," David agreed. "And you helped make it happen." "We helped make it happen," Zara corrected. "Together." They cut the ribbon alongside United CEO and several disability rights advocates. Cameras flashed. People applauded. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a woman in a wheelchair approached them, tears streaming down her face. "I've been afraid to fly for 5 years," she said. "After what happened to me on a flight, the way I was treated, I just couldn't face it again. But when I heard your story, when I saw what you did, I thought maybe things could be different. This is my first flight in 5 years. Thank you for giving me the courage to try again." Zara hugged her, this stranger who'd become family through shared experience. "You deserve to fly anywhere you want to go," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." As they walked through the airport that day, David noticed something he'd never seen before. People recognizing them, not with the curiosity of celebrity, but with the warmth of gratitude. A TSA agent who nodded respectfully. A gate agent who thanked them for their advocacy. A family with a disabled child who stopped to take a photo and say their daughter had been inspired by Zara's story. "You know what's funny?" David said as they sat waiting for their flight, because yes, they were flying again, this time on vacation to Hawaii. "I spent my whole adult life trying to prove that my disability didn't define me. Trying to show that I could be successful despite my wheelchair. But what happened on that flight, what came after, that taught me something different." "What's that?" Zara asked. "That my disability doesn't have to be something I succeed despite. It can be something I succeed through. By being visible, by being vocal, by refusing to hide or minimize my needs, I'm making space not just for myself but for everyone else who comes after. That's more important than any business deal I've ever closed." "So you're glad it happened?" Zara asked. David thought about it. "No. I'm not glad I went through that pain and humiliation. I'm not glad you had to be scared and had to make an impossible choice. But I'm glad we didn't let it break us. I'm glad we turned it into something meaningful. I'm glad that out of something terrible, we created something good." Their flight was called and they boarded early, during pre-boarding for passengers needing extra time. The flight attendant greeted them warmly, helped David store his wheelchair, and made sure they had everything they needed. It was such a simple thing, basic courtesy and professionalism, but it made all the difference. As the plane took off and Chicago disappeared beneath them, Zara looked out the window at the clouds, playing their old game in her head. What story did she see? She saw a dragon who'd been told he couldn't fly because his wings were different. But he flew anyway, higher and farther than anyone expected. And when he saw other dragons struggling on the ground, dragons who'd been told they couldn't fly either, he came back down. Not to carry them but to teach them. To show them that different wings could still soar. "What are you thinking about, baby girl?" David asked. "I'm thinking about the future," Zara said. "About all the things I'm going to do. I'm going to finish school. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to become an astronaut like I've always wanted. And I'm going to keep fighting for disability rights, because what happened to us can't keep happening to other people." "That's a good plan," David said. "You know I'll support you every step of the way." "I know," Zara said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling safe and loved and powerful all at once. "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby?" "Thank you for teaching me that our value doesn't come from what our bodies can do. That lesson saved me. It saved us both." David kissed the top of her head, his heart so full it hurt. "You taught me just as much as I taught you," he said. "You taught me that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you thought you were supposed to be protecting. You taught me that courage has nothing to do with age or size or experience. You taught me that speaking truth to power isn't just something adults do. It's something anyone can do when they decide that right matters more than comfortable." They flew on toward Hawaii, toward sunshine and beaches and the vacation they'd earned 100 times over. But more than that, they flew toward a future that looked different than it had 2 years ago. A future where airports had accessibility centers and airlines had better training and laws protected disabled travelers with real teeth. A future where a little black girl's voice on a 911 call had echoed loud enough to change an entire industry. Most people go their whole lives without making a real difference. Without standing at a crossroads between accepting injustice and fighting back and choosing to fight. Zara Mitchell did that at 9 years old, 30,000 feet in the air, with her father's life hanging in the balance and nothing but a phone and her own courage to save him. She didn't know she was making history when she dialed those 3 numbers. She just knew her daddy needed help. But sometimes that's how change happens. Not through grand plans or calculated moves, but through simple acts of love and courage in moments of crisis. The plane leveled off and Zara closed her eyes, Professor Trunks tucked under her arm, her father's hand holding hers. She dreamed of stars and spacecraft, of courtrooms and conference rooms, of all the fights she'd fight and all the people she'd help. She dreamed of a world where no child would ever have to call 911 because someone decided their parent didn't deserve dignity. She dreamed of a world where different was celebrated, not feared. She dreamed of a world where everyone, regardless of race or disability or any other difference, could fly first class and know they belonged there. That was the world she was going to help build. One brave choice at a time. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When was the last time you saw something wrong and actually did something about it? When was the last time you spoke up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves? Zara Mitchell was 9 years old when she changed an entire industry. She was scared, she was uncertain, but she was brave. What's your excuse? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about disability rights, about courage, about the power of one voice, then don't just watch and scroll on. Hit that subscribe button. Share this story. Talk about it. Because change doesn't happen when we're inspired for 5 minutes and then forget. Change happens when stories like this become part of our collective consciousness, when they challenge us to be better, to do better, to stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Zara Mitchell called 911 because her father's life was worth fighting for. Because dignity is worth fighting for. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the most important messages. The question is, are you listening? And more importantly, when it's your moment to be brave, will you take it? That's the challenge. That's the legacy. That's what it means to see injustice and refuse to look away. Be the person who makes the call. Be the person who speaks up. Be the person who changes things. Because the world doesn't need more people who know how to stay quiet and comfortable. It needs more people like Zara Mitchell who know that some things matter more than comfort. Our value isn't in what our bodies can do. It's in what our hearts choose to do. So what's your heart choosing today?